Another area where I think a lot of people have questions, and I know you've got a lot of expertise because a good part of your early career was actually on companies based in China. And you had immense success in terms of finding these businesses, kind of calling them out, shorting them, and not only profiting, but also, I think, kind of cleaning up a lot of that market. What is kind of your view of US-China relations and even Chinese companies, both based in China and then trying to cross-list into the US? It seems like there's like a geopolitical conversation and, are we in competition? Are we working together? Maybe both, kind of what's going on there. And then these companies, when you start looking at some of the legal structurings of the cross listings, the companies that are in China, it seems like there's still frauds that continue to pop up there. Like, just kind of talk a little bit about US and China and kind of how you're viewing those two markets right now.
Wow. Yeah, no, there's really a lot to unpack there too. Oh boy. Well, maybe the place to start is you characterized our earlier work as having helped clean up the space. And that was true for a moment in time. But what happened? So I started doing this by accident, really. I was out of the markets. I was living in China. I had a business there. And my father, who was a microcap investor, professional investor, he got really interested in these Chinese stocks that had listed in the US via reverse merger. They're all growing so quickly, so profitable. And what a gift to American investors that they chose the US to list. So I had no notion that there was widespread fraud here, but he asked me to look at one company initially. It was a company called Orient Paper. And, he told me some things about it that just seemed like red flags, but I didn't really want to look at this company because I had my own, just every day was like a grind, with my business there and was kicking my ass. But ultimately this was my father. So I took a look at it. And just before going up there to take a look at the factory, that's when I finally read the filings, and it was filled with obvious lies. I mean, these filings, just like prices, the valuation of land, of equipment. I mean, just shit that, because I'd been in China and doing business there long enough, I guess I was seeing the matrix and I knew that these things were lies. So wrote a report exposing that, having no idea that this was systemic, and, immediately was contacted by a lot of people who said, like, these are hedge funds who'd been shorting these things. Look at this one, look at that one. And just opening the 10Ks and like, oh my God, obvious fraud. So very soon realized that it was systemic. Now, why was this systemic? To some extent, the entire finance industry, there are just massive conflicts of interest and people can point fingers in other directions, but that's really acute when it comes to China. But ultimately, from the first wave of fraud, so we then sprinted. So this was June of 2010, we published this first report. And, I'd say that this wave ended in late 2013. Most of the Chinese companies' valuations in the US, at least the reverse merger ones, were in the toilet by then. And, the zeitgeist was China is uninvestable and nobody wanted to look at Chinese companies. And so what had happened was, during that whole wave of fraud, and that's chronicled in the movie The China Hustle that you talked about, only one company chairman ever has done material jail time in the US. And that's because he was actually a citizen of Taiwan, not of the PRC. Otherwise, China drew a moat around these guys. And then Chinese policy banks like China Development Bank began financing take privates of some of these obvious complete frauds. And so investors in the US were actually, or investors in quotes, if you were long these things, some of them got paid huge premia as these things were taken out. And so what China knew about us that, we evidently don't know about ourselves is that it's really easy to wipe our memory. So again, as China's cleaning up some of these total frauds, and most of them had just basically gone to well below $1 and traded on the pink sheets, if traded at all, by taking out a few of them, 2014 comes around. Alibaba is going to go public. everybody wanted Alibaba. Man, that was hot. It was sexy, this and that. So all of a sudden we're off to the races. And so then you got this next wave of Chinese IPOs, and these were generally online companies. And I mean, they were real businesses in most cases, like the RTOs, the reverse merger Chinese companies, and from the first wave, I mean, they weren't real businesses. Most of them were just basically empty boxes with like a facade of a factory. But these were more real, and they're online, so it's harder to prove. Now, we would look at the filings for a number of these things, and we would see that the tax treatments were fucked up. And that's pretty common with these frauds, because when you're making things up, one lie basically leads to, you need like 100 lies to cover up one lie. So you'd often see the strains in the tax treatment. But going public and saying to investors who, were just so desperate for more growth narrative, especially, since the US was recovering slowly from the GFC, saying like, hey, we think it's a fraud because these taxes don't make sense. Nah, people want the photos. They want the overwhelming proof. And I mean, at the end of the day, they didn't want us to be right. And by that point in time, we were also up against this kind of institutional barrier, which is all of these guys who basically pegged their careers to being long China stuff. Well, I mean, if you're now saying this, these larger, more established, companies are also frauds, what are they going to do with their careers? Like this is, like they'll die on this hill. And so there was so much institutional resistance in those instances. And then China also overtly turned hostile to people like us. And that actually happened in the summer of 2012 when they sent out Ministry of State Security personnel to basically every investigative firm in China. And, who are your foreign clients? What are they looking at? Are any of them hedge funds? Are they short sellers? And basically chilled that industry. And they put a lot of the government filings on lockdown as well. So today it's almost impossible to get these filings, but that's part of China's generally closing itself off. But everybody had forgotten about this and didn't care in the US until Luckin Coffee came along. Now, we didn't do the work on Luckin. Somebody else did. We publicized it. We went into their data room and validated it. And I know who did the work. So that also spoke to me a little bit more. But the fraud there was just so bad that the auditor actually had no choice but to find it when doing the audit, right after we had publicized this third party's work. And so it's just funny talking to reporters after Luckin imploded when, they're saying, wow, this is incredible. Like, bro, this has been the game forever. And understand this. And I think this is the big point that people really should take away from the situation is if nobody gets punished, which again, nobody except for one guy who was Taiwanese has done prison time in the US, and I'm sure none of them have done prison time in China for defrauding US investors. It's heads I win, tails I don't lose. If this thing works out, I make, I used to say tens of millions. Now it's hundreds of millions, maybe even north of $1 billion. If it doesn't work out, whatever. What have I lost from doing this? So that's the thing. And so people then after Luckin, what happened then was the SEC really started looking at it again, but the SEC hated and hates China cases because just the amount of time it takes to get stuff from China, then you have to get it translated, incredibly resource intensive. And even once it's translated, you don't understand the legal context. If you're an SEC enforcement attorney, you have to bring in people who are experts to explain it. It's super resource intensive and you almost never get anything out of it because they're able to sit in China and give the finger to the US regulators. And then China codified that into law in 2021, where any company must, with people or assets in China, must get express approval from the China Securities Regulatory Commission before cooperating with an overseas regulator. So China puts that in law that basically you can't even respond to the SEC, even if you're listed there. So, there's no way of protecting U.S. investors. And, I'm glad to see that the cynicism toward China has returned, but that was only after countless hard lessons have been learned by investors. And you know what? the moment China's GDP really, not the lie, the bullshit GDP number they give you, but like in reality, the moment China does start turning things around economically, everybody's going to want to forget these lessons and rush in with a bunch of cash and claim to have edge. And, oh, I know, I have Guanxi over there. And, the cycle will repeat because in the US, we just can't help ourselves.